Yes. Okay. So I will have like the formal opening of this session. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to our second publication training session, strengthening argument, making our article excellent. This is co-organized by the Emerging Researchers in Aging or ERA and the Journal of Global Aging or JoGA. And my name is Mengxing Zhou, and I'm an associate lecturer at the University of St. Andrews and one of the organizers of this training series alongside with Junjie and Martin. So before we begin, just a very few quick housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded and later posted in the Aging by BSG YouTube channel. And apologize that recording of the first session has not been uploaded yet. We will do it together with today's session. And also, please keep your mic off if you are not speaking, and do feel free to use chat to ask questions, share your thoughts and experiences if you feel more comfortable with it. Okay, and it's a really pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Christine Mair. Christine is an associate professor of sociology and gerontology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and it's early morning for her. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And I will leave it to Christine to offer a more thorough introduction about herself and her work during her talk. Okay, Christine, over to you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Nice to meet you all. My only warning is that when I share my presentation, I can't see anybody and I can't see the chat. So if the others could help me know, if anyone has a question, just really just pop in and ask along the way. It's not an interruption at all. I just don't want to like drone at you and just talk for 40 minutes. So if you do have questions, please jump in, put them in the chat. I would love to stop and address them when they come through while they're on your mind. So don't be shy about that at all. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about, let's see. Here we go.
Hey, 我来啦。
All right. Get this into presentation mode. So I'm going to talk until like maybe, 15 minutes. This session ends, well, for me at 9 a.m., but for you it ends in about 50 minutes. So we'll go through, I can speed up or slow down. I'll just keep an eye on the time here. So nice to meet everybody. I'm Christine Mair, as the lovely introduction said. I'm a director for our University Center for Health, Equity, and Aging. And we also just started a new center, a new NIA-funded center called the Southern Population Aging Research Center, or SPARC, SPARC, which is focused on looking at aging in the U.S. South and thinking about that. So I think I don't have a ton of examples about that today, but we could chat about it more if anybody wants. So I was trying to figure out, I was like, well, I should probably explain to them like what kinds of experience I've had from editing things. And I thought, well, I really didn't quite, you put it all together. I had to count all my students. I thought it does add up. To be clear, I'm going to go through these. These are just kind of standard things that you end up doing in the job eventually. This is not me seeking out editorial opportunities. I have a lot of respect for people who do that. I find it to be really tough. So this is just sort of stuff that happens. But at the same time, it means I've seen a lot of different examples. So I'm an editorial board member for the Journal Global Aging, for Journal Gerontology, Social Sciences, Research on Aging, and Journal of Cross-Cultural Gerontology. I've co-edited or I've edited and co-edited different things like a encyclopedia book. We're doing a special issue right now for social science and medicine, so I can talk about special issues a little bit more in case you have questions. From my experience, all of them are really different, so there's no kind of one formula. And I've also worked more intensely with the Journal for Cross-Cultural Gerontology. I review for a lot of journals. I have a really hard time saying no to reviews, so JoGA can keep that in mind. I usually end up saying yes. So I have a lot of different journals I've reviewed for. I just love seeing what people are writing about and trying to give feedback. And then I've had a lot of master's and PhD students, and that really adds up over the years. So you see a lot of different types of papers and just different ways that you might want to edit them to make them stronger. So these are some of the journals that I've published in. So I know we might be from like an interdisciplinary background. My PhD's in sociology, but I also work in gerontology and a little bit of public health. My previous degree is in anthropology and archaeology. So, depending on where you're coming from, I try to break these down into sort of categories to show, they're all a little bit different, of course, and the different disciplines will have different expectations. I think that especially when it comes to strengthening the argument of a paper, that some of these journals have a higher bar than others. And I don't mean that in, a disrespect to some of the others, but I think sometimes more of the medicine journals are a bit more empirical, they're shorter. So some of the theoretical arguments just don't need to be as defined or developed. But things that lean more towards sociology and social science and gerontology to an extent usually expect more. So that's also something to keep in mind. Um, Another thing I want to show is just a couple different examples. So these are some papers. I grabbed a few over the years that I wanted to tell you about before we kind of dive into this. The very first one that's listed was my master's paper, my master's project, my master's thesis. And then I had the second one listed is from my dissertation. The third one and the fourth one are papers that I started in graduate school with some of my friends or somebody I was working with, which is, really sad when you look at the 2023 date of the fourth one, but I'll get to that in a second. And then a couple other things. But I wanted to highlight these 5 articles to tell you all a little bit about them. First of all, the first one was projected a ton. It took a total overhaul. The editor knew that I was a student and gave me, I think, a little bit of like extra opportunity to revise. And then I had to do 3 revisions on top of that. So that was linked. I mean, I learned a ton through that process because that was one of my first papers, but these didn't like just go through. The second one, I remember this one. This is for my dissertation, 4 extensive revisions. And at the time, the journal was backed up. So this took me like, I don't know, 2 years to get through the revision process of this paper. And I was a brand new assistant professor. I was just trying to get a paper out. And the editor was really kind as well and gave me lots of good, helpful feedback. This paper, we had a co-author disappear. The reviewers wanted us to replicate everything in a brand new data set. So we had to do that and, put all this together. So that was also, kind of intensive. My favorite one, number 4, was rejected 9 times. 9 times it was rejected. And I swear this is a good paper. I love this paper. But this is about fit. So the co-authors, we had different ideas about where to send it, whether it should go to a public health journal or where it should go. And we had to reframe the argument a million times because this one was based on a small sample in Texas. So it wasn't on like big nationally representative data. And we were kind of torn, like as a case study of a city, should it be framed like hyper contextually, focusing a lot on that area, or should it be something that we try to frame a bit more broadly? So this could be really relevant if you're thinking about like a single country study or a single city within a country study, kind of how to frame that. And then the last one, this paper is 100% just descriptive statistics. It's really not fancy at all. One reviewer loved it. I feel like the other reviewer was never really sold on it. And so this is just a way to say that you can publish different things and have different experiences. You're still going to get rejected a lot, and you're still going to have to continually to refine your argument. I have an R&R now, and they're like, your argument needs strengthening. And I'm like, I know, I should work on that and learn how to do that. So we'll talk about that a bit today. So we are all on the same page here. We might be at different phases of experience, but this never stops, essentially. And it's just a good practice to keep in mind. All right, so there's different thoughts on why papers get rejected, and I'm sure that Martin has more to say about that than I do because he sees, more examples of it as being sort of at the head of the journal there, but you can tell me, you all can jump in and let me know if you think this is true. For the most part, I think if there are big fundamental flaws in their methods or data or conclusions, they're more likely to get either desk rejected, or if they make it through to review, this is a real minority of papers. It's rare that I think I see something that just is so flawed and like, that we're just going to reject it outright like that. So that's pretty rare, more uncommon. It happens, but I think, all of you are, we could always put a flop paper together. Everybody can, but for the most part, our papers are a little bit more put together than this. So the more common causes, I think this is a really great session to offer because I think a lot of it does have to do with the argument. One might be a lack of clarity in the measures and data and analysis, and we're not going to talk a lot about that today, but that's something, you might get feedback like you didn't explain your data set or your measures very well, and you're like, yeah, that's true. I need to go back and fix that. So that tends to be pretty common. But the other three, I think, are also really common, especially if it's a journal that does want some theoretical and conceptual grounding, which most of the journals in social science do. If it doesn't have that, or it's not clear enough, or it's not developed enough, you'll get feedback on that. Many times it might be like a lack of novelty, or it may not be a new enough contribution. We want replication. I think we need a lot more replication in science, but at the same time, we also need to kind of explain, even if it's not completely new, what is it adding to the literature, right? Even if that is replication, why do we need that replication so much? And many journals will actually, for that third bullet point, when they ask reviewers, if you've been kind of on the other side of it, they'll ask like, how much of a contribution to the literature do you think this paper will make? Like minor, moderate, or strong? And so they are asking the reviewers, like, are you convinced that this paper is contributing something that's going to move kind of science ahead in some way? The other thing that you can get dinged for is like overstatements. So maybe you're really getting into it and you're actually explaining things in a lot of detail. You might go overboard. You might overstate the implication of your findings. You might overstate your contribution. You might overstate your novelty. So the way I kind of frame this is you want to have like cautious confidence. You want to be confident that what you're doing is contributing something and provide that knowledge and explanation to them, but you also want to be humble about it, of course, and be cautious. There's nothing that will make a reviewer more upset than if you state something like, now we conclude this, and we found proof of this, or something like that, because that's just very unscientific to make these sort of firm conclusions based upon a single study, right? Science is cumulative. So, you want to be part of that accumulation of knowledge, and you want to identify where your little notch is in that accumulation of scientific knowledge without making, too broad of a claims. So for today, we're just going to focus most on these last three bullet points. I think everyone might be coming from really different methodologies. I do not primarily, I do all quantitative work, not because I think it's better, but my graduate program didn't have much, qualitative training. So it was a pretty quantitative program. So I tried to keep this focused more on the theories and concepts, but I am aware that the structure of qualitative papers, quantitative papers, everything in between, and everything else really does differ. So, just keep in mind this is sort of a loose framework that you might need to adapt to whatever style or paper you're doing. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is academic arguments. So when I got, I think this is a good phrase for this session, but I also started to, as a social scientist, think about the term argument. And I think that the term argument should be a little bit problematized or sort of thought critically about in this case before we kind of dive into it about what we mean by an argument. So what is an argument and what is not an academic argument? You probably are, some of you might be very familiar with this, but I do see this a lot when I'm looking through papers or reviewing things. So even if it doesn't apply to you, it's out there in the world. So I want to go over it a little bit. We might see things like a statement like, this pattern is deeply troubling, versus this pattern suggests a mismatch between X and Y. You want to be really careful about your wording when you are making an argument. When we say strengthening the argument, we mean, what I'm going to get into is strengthening the evidence-based case for what you're doing, but you do want to have some passion and care inserted into that, but you don't want this to be something where you're offering your editorializing on the topic. And there's several reasons for that. So you don't want this argument to be a moral evaluation. You don't want it to read as opinion and advocacy for the most part. Now, there are certain types of writing that might be more advocacy related or social justice related. So I'm not saying that those works aren't valuable or shouldn't be a part of this, nor am I saying that you shouldn't have morals opinions or things that you want to advocate for. We are humans and we have a lot of strong ideas about how we think the world should be. And it's, especially when there's rough times going on and there's rough issues that we're looking at. So you're not supposed to take that away from yourself. And I'll talk a bit more about what Max Weber said about this as a sociologist, that we do want to be really deeply informed by this, but we want to be careful about how we present it. And I'll explain why. We do want a theory-based claim supported by empirical evidence. And we do want something that is nuanced by context. So we might have like a theory says this, evidence says this, but oftentimes you're dealing with a contextual nuance of location or country or scope or maybe time, population, different conditions, different mechanisms, and you want to communicate that as well. So let me get more into that. So arguments are more convincing when they don't have a lot of opinion in them. That's sort of the irony of it. If we say something like this finding clearly demonstrates a failure of the system versus, this is maybe an extra light version, this indicates limitations in how the system functions under these conditions. It might seem like that second one has all the soul taken out of it, and that might be true to an extent. But here's the issue when we get, and these are two more extreme examples, but when we get into highly opinion-based arguments in our papers, this is what I tell my students all the time. The first thing that you do if you do that is you narrow your audience. You narrow your audience substantially to only people who already agree with you. So you have to ask yourself, am I writing to people that already agree with me about a topic? Or am I trying to write to a broad audience to reach them and talk to them and show them through, scientific argument and data that this is important and valuable? If you throw in the opinions, especially in the beginning with your framing, you're asking the reader to agree with you without first backing it up with scientific evidence. You're signaling your bias even to those who already agree with you. So, if you're writing like that, even people who totally agree with you on all the topics that you're discussing might still be like, but how am I supposed to guide my way through this if it leads with this kind of writing? It actually shifts the attention more to you and I don't mean ego in an arrogant way, but you and your own like sense of self. You want your voice to be in there, but you don't want this to be about you because it's not. And what all this does is it signals to the reader that there's a reason to not trust you in your writing because you haven't yet given them the information that they need to be able to follow you and to be able to, see what your logic is. So you want to do a logic evidence-based argument. Even though we all agree that certain things might be immoral and awful and failures, we might all agree on that. That's not the place to put it in the academic argument. So you want the evidence-based argument. It's far more convincing. First of all, it broadens your audience to people of all different perspectives, not just people who already agree with you. It's inviting evaluation, critique, discussion, appropriate scientific caution. It's not just asking them to just agree with you. It communicates your open-mindedness as a scientist to multiple outcomes. When I was an undergraduate, I worked with some people who didn't like the outcome of a paper, the finding, and so they're like, well, we don't want to publish it because we don't like the outcome. Right? Like, oh, that's very scientifically wrong, right? So you need to show that you're open to what your results might be, whatever they might be. It centers the attention on theory and data rather than you and your own perspectives, and it immediately signals to the reader that they can trust you in your writing. So that's kind of a quick disclaimer on what we mean by argument, and that might be clear for some people, but I think that not always, right? So I just want to go over that. All right, so I'm just kind of keeping an eye on my time. I think I'm doing all right. Tell me if I'm talking too fast. Sometimes I get a little fast. So what does it mean to have a strong academic argument? And in the work session after this, we're going to look and kind of do some more discussion of this. I think for the most part, a lot of examples that we're going to go over and that we see really are strong. We want to make them stronger, like this session suggests, like how to strengthen existing ones. But before we can strengthen an argument, an academic, evidence-based argument, we need to identify what makes a strong argument, right? So where do you start? I like to think of this as like there's like an acorn that's going to grow into a tree in terms of like your idea and your concept and your purpose. So everything is going to flow together better in your paper from the very beginning if you have this combination of your interest and the scientific gaps. And that is the start and formation of the paper. We're under pressure to publish and do these different things. So sometimes you hop on a paper and you're helping out with something, or you have to write something that you don't really care a great deal about. Try to find the interest in it. Try to get yourself a little bit invested in it. I know it sounds a little counter to what I said about the opinion, but I'll explain in a moment. It just makes the writing process better. It's going to make you think, I think, more carefully about the contribution. You're going to have a bit more passion about it. And you want to stay really focused on the gaps in the literature as well. So, I've mentioned Max Weber before, famous sociologist, but, he says it's really good actually to use your genuine thoughts and feelings and interests, your passions, your curiosities, your frustrations as the inspiration for what topics to study. And I find this to be a really good place to go. Like, as you kind of get some jobs, you don't have this option, but, you can find something in it that makes you interested. I love to use frustration as a motivator, where I read a paper and I'm like, okay, that's fine, but they didn't do this, and I wish they would have mentioned this. So when you're reading, take notes. Like when you're reading literatures for different things, what's bothering you, what's missing, or what's making you excited, right? And those are great kind of kernels, acorns to start with. What's yet to be examined empirically, what's yet to be examined conceptually. If you don't have kind of this basic idea where you have gaps and you have an interest, I think you need to go back to the beginning a little bit more. Like if you get this kind of paper back and you get feedback and they don't really see the argument, just take some time to think about it. Find that kind of acorn of your interest and gap overlap, rework it a little bit, go back to that beginning. You kind of have to get it straight in your head before I think it starts to flow out in the paper. You can figure it out as you edit, but it really helps. So this is really more of like I have a picture of like in the background of like looking down on the earth. We could spend this time going through like breaking down examples of text about a good argument, but I really think that it's actually it flows through the whole body of the paper, which is what I'm going to kind of argue today, that it flows through the whole body of the paper in specific ways. You have to hit it. And so it needs to be something that you kind of do have a little bit of a sense of in your mind as you go into write or as you go into edit and strengthen it. So a little bit of passion balance, like you have to have the interest, but you also have the science, and you kind of want these things to be balanced. You don't want it to be without any heart, and you don't want it to be all heart without any science, right? Or that's kind of the way, I think the best way to kind of frame it. Okay, so what is the architecture of a strong, what we're calling strong academic argument? These are the kind of standard sections of paper, of course, although I know that this will differ depending on what kind of methods you're using and what style you're using. So we're going to focus, though, I think I mentioned before, methods and results are really different for different papers. So I'm leaving those aside for now. They're not irrelevant to the argument. I do talk a little bit about how they should be structured in sort of a paired sort of style, but I'm not going to go into them in depth. And because what I know the term for my age group is what, elder millennial. Because I'm an elder millennial, I'm going to use a PowerPoint animation that's really dorky to get your attention here on purpose. Don't worry, I don't think that actually looks cool, but I had to do this a couple times to help you remember. This is like meant to be, remember this geeky PowerPoint slide and situation. The number one thing is, do not force the reader to work to find your argument. Just remember that, like, and I'm going to talk about this again at the end, they need you to show it. Like, you want them to like your paper. They're going to get annoyed or lose interest if they can't find the thread. They can't find the plot. You need to make it really easy to follow you. So there is a little bit of redundancy, but it's more about packaging and more about consistency. So you want them to, you want them to like your paper. You want them to follow it, whether it's the audience or the person reviewing it. So just think about it in that way a little bit, like from their perspective. You do not want to make this hard on them. So that's kind of a place to start at with when we think about this. All right. So getting into this, the architecture of a strong academic argument, I'm just going to go through section by section a little bit and give some sort of places where I think and things to think about with each one. The introduction really should be clear, and I have this in the prompts for the workshop as well. Why should anyone care about what you studied? Like, we don't just care because maybe it's this hasn't been studied before. Like, that's kind of not enough. We need to provide a bit more justification, or they studied this, but they didn't do include this variable. That's like empirically fine, but we need to give the kind of conceptual logic, the motivation behind it in a stronger way. Why does it matter that they use this variable instead of that variable? Why does it matter that they use this sample and it had these flaws in it? Why do we need to use this other sample? You also, not always, but I think in general in our work in aging research, we often want at least, if not theoretical implications, at least societal, sometimes policy implications. So, what can we really get out of this? It's not like, we don't want to overstate it and say like, now that my paper is published, people can do interventions. That might be true if you're doing a really applied paper. But typically we're just kind of contributing to that body of literature that might help, articulate what policies might be best in these conditions. So you want to tell them that. You don't want them to have to think of it. You're the expert on this, and they're going to rely on you to point out that implication for them. So after reading the introduction section, especially the literature, but really like from right at the beginning, that reader should know exactly where you're going, how you're going to get there, and really for the argument purpose, why you're going there. So that needs to be really clear for them from the get-go. And what, if you all are staying for the workshop next, we're going to look at like these excerpts and be like, really, is it clear where they're going and why they're going there? That's like the step number one. It's not easy to do though. And sometimes I actually write this section at the end. You don't have to write this in order. Like I'll go back and write that very first section at the very end after I kind of figure out what my Eggcorn idea point is and it sharpens a bit. So, you can write this in any order that you want, as long as it gets in there at some point, right? So literature review section, it should mention literature that tests like same or similar hypotheses, variables, data. The literature is kind of like infinite. I always get overwhelmed. And so you just want to make sure, of course, you know how to write a literature review, but that you focus on things that are similar hypotheses, similar variables, maybe similar data. And however, I think the key part for a strong argument is I'm thinking about, I always need like a kind of like a geeky metaphor or a cheesy metaphor for whatever I'm thinking about. So I was thinking about this as a pyramid, that you're building a pyramid, or you're laying like a trail behind you. As you go through each section, however you organize it, you can, there's lots of different styles. You want to start to lay bricks or lay this little trail along the way of your literature review. So what that means is like going brick by brick or leaving this trail of crumbs behind you. For each like section that you have in your literature review, you want to start to kind of like hint at what they did not address. Like, here's a set of papers that studied loneliness in this area, but they didn't do this. And you don't want to say all the gaps in one. You want to sprinkle the gaps in as they become relevant to each section. This branch of literature didn't really address this. This branch of literature didn't really address this. This third branch of literature did all these great things, but they didn't really address this. Ideally, these are slightly different gaps that they have in these little literatures. And you're just sort of mentioning, well, they did this, but they weren't able to examine it from a cross-national perspective. Or they did this, but they focused only on this population. So you want to just sort of lay that trail and start to build up this pyramid, which is going to eventually combine to create kind of the point. So if you take these little hints that you gave throughout the literature from these, like, let's say you have 3 different sections, you gave 3 different hints, each one was missing something different. By the time you come together to talk about your motivation and what you're doing, it's the overlap of all those gaps together. Be like, well, taken together, there's no paper that's done X, Y, and Z, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And you want to keep it tight. Like I sometimes say to students, there's a lot of gaps in the literature. Part of the argument is like you kind of want to highlight the gaps that are the ones that you're going to fix, right? Like there are many, many gaps that might exist. You want to highlight the ones that you're about to address. As part of the strategy, right? Otherwise, if you start flashing off and talking about some other type of gap, they're going to think your paper is about that. If you're like, well, there's this study, but no one's ever studied it, in South America, I'm going to assume that your paper is going to focus on South America, right? So you need to make sure that those little breadcrumbs that you leave, the bricks that you're laying down, are actually leading towards what you're going to be doing. And that's part of the strategy of it. Okay. So then this section with literature review also, different things. We can talk a lot more about this. I wasn't sure how much detail you wanted in terms of thinking about how to generate gaps, because these are really at the heart of the strong argument. It's possible that your problem has never been studied, but that's pretty unlikely. It's more likely your problem has been studied, but there are limitations either in the concepts or the methods that you hope your study can correct, or that maybe more often that the previous work didn't examine specific nuances, different populations, locations, culture, mechanisms, especially maybe different variables. You think there's a mediation or a moderation. Maybe the data it hasn't been studied recently, or there are better measures now. So there's lots of ways that we could dig into this and talk about this. Again, this is a little quantitatively leaning, so I apologize for that. But we can kind of chat about how it might apply to other types of papers if you'd like. So getting into the motivation and research questions, you want to state your gaps that you laid the trail for already in a combined sentence, right? So if you'd sprinkled in like, this literature lacks this, and this one lacks this, and this lacks this, now you want to say, okay, there's no studies that do this, there's no studies that do this, and you kind of put them all together. I like to put, whether you call it a research question section or what you call it, you really want to somewhere have in there, just tell yourself you need to have a paragraph about motivation, whether you label it that or not. And having a motivation paragraph really forces you to write that argument out, especially if you'd already laid the trail for it in the literature review. So you want to talk about like, why do these gaps matter, especially when you combine them? So I've got this little little mandala, like kind of like a Venn diagram, like when you put them all on top of each other, like then what's really missing when you consider them as a body of gaps, like as a group of gaps. Now, here's another thing, is they need to match. I think that papers are better organized. The argument is clear if everything matches. So like your gap should line up to your research questions, right? So you articulate, this is missing, this is missing, this is missing. So your research questions need to look at this, this, and this. And so you want this to kind of match like a repeated print. Not in a redundant way, but you want it to be clear, like, okay, here are the 3 gaps that they laid out. And then each of these 3 research questions address those gaps. And that should be clear, aligned. So alignment is really key. You can kind of convert each gap into a research question or combine them or something like that. If you do have hypotheses, they should also match those gaps in research questions. They should be, very much aligned in that way. Okay. So discussion section, I have kind of a thought about this in terms of it's like knitting things back together. It's what my little geeky image is for this. In the discussion section, I think this is like what I'm trying to point out here is like where in the paper are the real kind of key features for a strong argument. Discussion section should always have, I think, a first paragraph where you remind them again, like what are the gaps? And I put this kind of as a package: gaps, motivation, research questions, hypotheses are relevant. Like this is a package. These things are like tied together. So restate that like gap, motivation, research question package for them. And if that doesn't package well together, you want to go back and align those better. And then you want to summarize the 2 or 3 main findings. You have a ton of findings very likely in your paper, right? You really want to focus on the 2 to 4 ones that again align with the gaps, motivations, and research questions. So that's what you really want to bring out in the discussion section, the answers to that package that you set up in the front, or the potential answers, the findings that really address that. So you want that alignment present. What I do oftentimes is I take what I think are those main things that answer my like gap, motivation, research question package, and I make a subsection of the discussion section to answer each one. You can label it with subtitles or not. I do, like for my students that are working on their dissertations, I usually say like list out your 2 to 4 main findings as a sentence and then convert them into a phrase, like a little paraphrase, and make that little phrase your subtitle of your discussion section, because it makes it really clear for people to see, boom, boom, boom. I asked these questions, here are the answers, and they don't have to search through to find it, and it just makes it feel clearer for them and makes it obvious. Do not restate your findings. So a lot of times in a discussion section, people spend this time to just continue to summarize their findings. This is like a common thing that people do, but that's not what this section is for. You already had your results section, so really resist this urge. We all find ourselves doing this. Try to resist this urge. Remember that what you need to do in this section is take kind of the take-home points of your findings, those main big picture things, and you need to knit those, like weave those back together with your literature and your theory. So this is where you take the front end of your paper. You basically are taking the front end of your paper and your results section, and you're like weaving them together. And so you want that discussion section to kind of, it's going to, go through the results a bit, but you need to keep pulling back in. Tell yourself you need to cite literature and theory back in a section. And if you're not, then you're probably not digging back into it the way that you need to. You're not knitting the way you need to. So, and also be very careful, of course, to overstate the findings. Potential implications. What do they tell us empirically, conceptually? What do they contribute? did it resolve the original gaps or problems or not? It's okay if they didn't. Like maybe it didn't really offer what you thought it would. That's okay. Reflect on that and talk about that. I always think that getting results that are not statistically significant is like very significant. It's really interesting. And it doesn't mean, we know we have a problem where like, null findings don't get published enough if you didn't find significance. But if all theory says that this should be significant and it's not, that's actually really important to talk about. Maybe your analysis is underpowered. Again, I'm kind of quantitatively talking, or maybe it's just not found in your population. Maybe this difference doesn't exist in what you were looking at, or maybe something else explained it. Like, talk about that. There's plenty that you can say that's really, really interesting. So that's the most boring thing, is to find exactly what was hypothesized. I mean, we think we want that, but that's kind of boring in a way, right? So you hope that you get a little bit more interest in your results, something that you have to explain and kind of work through a little bit. And then alternative interpretations and questions. But yeah, I really think knitting that argument together with literature and theory is key for this section. All right, last little bit, and then I'll talk about a few more kind of like closing thoughts, is that in the conclusion, so it depends on where you want to put this. I think limitations need to be somewhere, but they shouldn't be last in your paper. I think future research should be somewhere. Sometimes people bundle this together in a conclusion, and you could title it these different things, or maybe some of this goes in the discussion section. You can kind of decide what makes sense. But you want to, if they're not already in the discussion, throw them in the conclusion, usually. The conclusion should wrap everything up in like a tidy package with that kind of repeated wrapping pattern that we had, the package of the gaps, the motivation, the findings that are all like aligned together. And this is really your chance to like tie it up with a nice bow. So you just want to briefly remind them about the gaps and motivation. This is your argument, that little package. Gaps, motivation, research question is really your argument package. And then 2 or 3 major findings and implications. And that's where I say, be confident, but cautious. I just got a paper back, and one reviewer was like, you overstated your findings. And the other reviewer said, you were way too cautious about your findings, and you need to be more confident about them. I was like, okay, well, so sometimes you get that, and they have completely different interpretations, and you just have to kind of, try to balance it the best you can. They're probably both right, so it's something that we all always struggle with. As my advisor used to say, the main thing you want to do is, I think, end on a high note. Don't end with limitations. Like, I just think that those last couple sentences of your paper are really key to reinforce your academic argument. Like, sprinkle in, like, is where you can put your heart back in a little bit, your final sentences. Like, really focus on those last sentences. I know that maybe nobody reads every word of our papers, but oftentimes, like, students or people who are just glimpsing will really read the abstract, the intro, and the conclusion. So, like, if anything, those are the highest read parts of your paper. So you do want them to be able to see everything packaged in that conclusion. And you really want to end on a very like clear statement about what your argument was, what you were seeking to do, what you found, and really why it's so important and the potential implications of that. So just like, I know you get tired at the end, me too, but like these last 2 sentences I think are really crucial to sort of wrapping up that whole package and creating this kind of seamless connection between the intro to the conclusion, where you weave the argument throughout. So in general, a couple thoughts on this though, to kind of wrap up with my geeky image here again. Match the paper kind of like a repeated pattern with your argument. Sentences in the lit review that lay the trail of gaps are a big part of your argument. That kind of cluster statement of gaps, motivation, research questions should match together. Analysis and results are usually structured kind of around those. Your 2 to 3 major findings and take-home points, and then use those to kind of guide what you're going to say and how you're going to organize your discussion section is my advice. Most importantly, redundancy, like sometimes you might get a little redundant, but maybe not redundancy, but a repeated pattern is actually a little bit helpful because the reader is like might be reading a bunch of different things and it's just hard. You kind of want to like hit them over the head with it a tiny bit. Think of it like this. You are like the tour guide, and you need to pull the reader along by the hand and point things out along the way, especially in the lit review. Like you're like, okay, you're in this vast forest of literature. You're like, over here are the blah, 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 blah trees, which but they don't do blah, blah, blah. And over here, so you have to think of yourself as like the tour trail guide who's leading the reader along in a vast jungle. And you're pointing out what they should be paying attention to along the way that's going to guide you to your kind of final destination. This is my cheesy image that I asked ChatGPT to make, right? You're the trail guide, green flag in it, and you're like, hey, everyone, come over here. But when I was trying to make this, it kept giving this guy extra arms, which I thought was hilarious. And I was like, actually, he looks great with extra arms because you're pointing out lots of things, not just like one thing. So I just thought he could be like he could be like a god with multiple arms here. So you want to be like guiding them and be like, look at these 3 things that you should be paying attention to. And they need you to do that. They need you to guide them. They need you to be your leader. So you want to have a voice. You want to have your voice in the paper. You want to be kind of the leader there in the paper. I'm going to wrap up, but I have, so we can ask some questions in chat. But my academic argument about academic arguments is that it's paper wide. So like there's no, like I didn't want to focus on like how we make a single section. I really think this is about the whole body of the paper. It's a top down. It requires orchestration between all the pieces. They have to kind of sing together on a similar tone is the idea. You want to articulate why it matters, identify the gaps, have that tight alignment between the pieces, because again, there's infinite literature, infinite questions. Your results have all types of stuff. They're gonna rely on you to guide them through what to pay attention to. A kind of repeated narrative structure actually is pretty helpful. And just be like, careful and cautious about your results. But of course, you might get reviewers that tell you to be more confident about it. I just don't think there's any reason to make strong conclusions based on a single analysis of a data set, but some people think so. So what we're going to do, if you're in the second section, we're going to go through these kind of questions a bit more. I have like some longer ways that I kind of phrase these out to talk about like just kind of breaking it down to sort of 5 components that we could look through. So we could talk more about that if you want. And then I did want to say, like, they asked me to talk a little bit about special issues. So there's different examples. Journal Global Aging has several up. I love special issues. If I see one that matches my stuff, I like try to go for it. They get more cited than other regular issues. They're also just like more interesting. I love being with like a package of papers that it feels like it advances science a bit more. So I really recommend them, but really I would say only submit to them if you already feel like it's a strong fit to your work, because they really are often signaling certain literatures and certain disciplines and certain methods. I'll show you that. But if you are going to write to a special issue, I just say it's kind of like the bonus next level of argument, like leveling up. You want to not only have your paper have that argument, but you also have to have an argument that matches the special issue core problem. So you've got your paper argument. It's like a multi-level model. You've got your paper and what it's doing, and then you've got to link it up to the bigger body that they're trying to do with the special issue. The language of the call is going to be really signaling. They're super signaling in these calls. You can tell what kind of like methods they're looking for, what kind of literatures they're looking for. So if you don't read the signals in this call, it's probably not a good call for you. It's probably not a strong match to you. If you read the call and you're like, okay, yeah, I know that, this feels familiar, I understand this, then that's more likely to be a good call for you. You're going to want to say how the paper advances the agenda of the special issue. You want to frame it as the theme of the special issue, not just the broader literature. You want to go through that issue, like the conceptual debates that issue is going to be examining, and why your paper is really contributing something distinct for that potential special issue that the others may not be doing. You want to kind of demonstrate your uniqueness there, and you want to kind of keep that, the special issue implications throughout the discussion. So just a quick example, and then I'm going to end. This is some of the ones special issues for Journal Global Aging. I highlighted and read some of the signaling. So like these 2 are really different. Like the first one is creative and participatory approaches in global context. The second one is like loneliness and isolation. I would read this first one as being a lot more qualitative potentially. The second one might be a bit more quantitative, but not necessarily. They've got words in here that signal. So you can see what they're doing here. Let me get my pointer up. This is like a lived mode of aging, participatory, arts-based, mutual entanglement of creativity, reflexive methods. I would not be a good fit for this. I would not know how to produce a paper that would fit with what they're looking for. It looks awesome, but this is definitely a certain like subsection, subdiscipline methods that would fit well with this. The second one is looking at like social inequalities, deficit-based models. They're saying psychology, histories of work migration. This might be maybe a bit more quantitative. I'm not, not necessarily though. And you can see the kinds of things they want you to pay attention to. So like you'd want to have these things in, maybe not all of them, but some of them in your paper and like kind of see that it's a match. So I'll end there, but we can chat more. I've got the other examples too that I kind of highlighted, and we could just sort of see what we want to chat about.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for the insights you shared. And I think particularly for opening the session by talking about the journey behind your 5 publications, because I think we often hear polished success stories, but it was really genuinely inspiring to hear about the realities behind those success stories, like struggles, challenges, and even failures. So thank you again. And now I will stop the recording and invite questions, comments